The name of this sermon is I'm an Open Book. As you know, there's there's been lots of sermons preached on the 7 things Jesus said from the cross. It's a favorite topic in the time of Easter. But there are also 7 things that Jesus spoke in his trial. If you go Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, there's 7 things. And so in the next 7 weeks, we're going to look at the 7 things that Jesus said in his trials. And this is the first one. Now, I think it's interesting that there are 7 things. 7 confrontations that are recorded before the chief priests and Pilate. The most interesting thing about them, the defining characteristic as I see it, is that these don't seem to be the answers in the words of someone who is in any way guilty, who is thinks that I got to be careful what I say because they can sentence me to death. Jesus doesn't do that at all. He's even confrontational. He's not afraid at all. He's being, well, not like a person on trial. In the normal sense of a trial. He's not treating it like a trial at all. He knows he's going to go to the cross. He knows that the trial won't be fair, and he'll be found guilty no matter what the evidence is or where it leads. So he has another plan, an eternal plan. The things he said, as you consider them, they hold our feet to the fire. Put us in trial, as it were, as much as those who heard them the first time. Now, if we were on trial, what can we do? What can we look at? We can look at the evidence for who Jesus is. In 1974, as far away as that is, where you said about the truck you bought, Josh McDowell wrote a book called The Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It was a very important book, and what it did is, it was like a trial, and he was asking the question, is there enough evidence to convict Jesus of being the Son of God, the Messiah, the person who he said he was? That was what this book was about. Now, my next door neighbor, we talked a lot. He's since moved away, he's only home on the weekends, but we talked a lot. He's a homosexual, and we discussed about Jesus. And he was of the opinion that the Gospels were written 300 years after the events that they talk about. So 300 AD, and they were written for the purpose of this religion wanted to portray Jesus in a certain way. And that's how he felt. He didn't trust the accounts. He was sure that they couldn't be trusted. And these talk of miracles and the talk of Jesus being risen from the dead was just this picture that this religion wanted to portray. So I thought we should look at the evidence a little bit, just for a minute. Now, we're not going to look at all of it because it would be weeks and weeks, but I want to look at Luke. Now, here's what we know about Luke. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Acts. And if Luke was a fictional character and he was being written about 300 years later by someone, what is the most important thing that happened to the Jewish nation around that time? Well, it was the destruction of Israel, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. And if this person was writing 300 years past that, what a great thing to include in your account. You could use that information. Like, here's to prove that God is moving on. But Luke never included that in Acts at all. He finishes the book of Acts with Paul in prison in Rome. And we know from other letters that Paul wrote after he was released, that he was also, he had continued his gospel preaching after he was in Rome. And we know that he didn't mention anything about Israel being destroyed, Jerusalem and the temple being destroyed. So we have to look at that and say, well, if this was a fictional book, they would have included that, but if it isn't there, it has to move all of that ahead. It's not 300 years, it's much, much closer to 33 AD, or whatever time it was that Jesus died. And if that's the case, and he wrote Acts after he wrote Luke, that would push Luke farther ahead. So if we say that he wrote Acts around 60 AD, and Luke maybe 2 or 3 years earlier, that would be between 55 and 60 AD, and all of the Bible people that research the Bible say that Mark was written first, and Luke used it as a source. They think Peter dictated what he wanted to say to Mark, and Mark wrote it down. So if that moves Mark even farther, closer to the time that Jesus died and rose again, and at that time, if that would be 50 AD, that's 17 years. And there would be lots of people who would still be alive when all those events happened. And if it was a fictional book, if Luke just made it all up, there would be lots of people who would say, well, this is not real. And it would cease to exist. But all of the people that were Christ's followers were saying over and over again, this is true. The people that were Jesus' disciples all died, they were given the option. Well, there's a story here of, this is just one of the 11 disciples. This is the story of Andrew. He was arrested, and they said, if you recant your belief and the words you're preaching about Jesus, we'll allow you to live. And he says, no, bring the cross on. And he spent 3 days on the cross, and as long as his tongue would work, he told everybody that was standing around on the cross, he encouraged them. He said, remain steadfast in the word and doctrine you have received, that you may dwell with God in eternity and receive the fruit of his promise. That was the words that we read. He says, stand faithful. And the people, his friends, after 3 days, appealed to the governor. He's been punished enough. Please let him down. And he said no. He prayed to God to not allow him to get back from the cross. He wanted to go to heaven. He wanted to be with Jesus. And he prayed that prayer, and then he died. Well, other of the Christians were burned at the stake. But they didn't burn. The wood around them burned, but they stood there in the fire, and they were all right. And John the disciple, was arrested. And they had him in a big auditorium, and they said, how are we going to kill him? Well, they were going to burn him at the stake, but they said, well, some of these apostles don't burn. And so they came up with the idea of boiling him in oil. And oil boils at 600 degrees, which you can imagine being lowered into a vat that's boiling at 600 degrees. And so that's what they did. They lowered him into this big vat of oil boiling, and he stood there. And he stood there, and the hush came over the arena. This is not the way someone boiled in oil reacts. He screams, and he stood there for a while, and nothing happened. And then he started loudly praising God for the fact that he was still alive, and the fact that God had rescued him, and God can do miracles. And eventually they took him out of it, and they sent him to the island of Patmos. Well, the common denominator of all these Christians was that Jesus was who he said he was. They were convinced that he was the Christ. He was very God of very God. And torture would not diminish their resolve at all. Well, let's move back to the text, this text we just read. Well, these religious leaders had an awesome opportunity. They were in the presence of God. They could ask him anything, but they had no respect for him. Jesus is saying, you leaders have the same opportunity as Moses and Abraham. Moses and Abraham got to speak to God. And he's there. Why would you fail to take advantage of this? Shame on you. All the previous generations were hoping and praying for this opportunity. And now that it was available, they were not interested in more than that, they were hostile to it. They were putting him on trial, or that's what they thought. But everything they were doing was illegal. It was at night. It was all illegal, against the rules that they were supposed to abide by. What they didn't realize is the real trial, the proper trial, had happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it wasn't about whether he was guilty or innocent. It was whether he would do that very thing that he'd come to do to save all of those people, the other group who were found guilty. Now, number one is the questions they knew the answer to. In verse 19 it says, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Now, to be fair with these men, they understood, they had a good grasp of history, and they understood that in times past, in the Maccabee revolt, the Jewish people had revolted against Rome, and Rome conquered them and put down the revolt, and they lined up crosses all the way from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's like 50 miles of crosses with people, Jewish people hanging on them. This was clear in their mind, in their memory, and they didn't want this to happen again. They knew that there was a steady stream of people who were unhappy with the Roman government, and a certain percentage of those unhappy people would start a revolt, and they gained 300 or 400 followers, and the religious leaders would deal with it, or they would send a quiet message to the governor of Rome, and he would deal with it. And they could be one step back so that they didn't look like they actually were killing the folk heroes of the Jewish people. They wanted to be seen as the common people. Jay Leno told this story. He said, because he has a whole lot of old cars, there's what's called Jay Leno's garage. It's really great if you like old cars. But anyway, somebody came to him and said, look, what kind of car do you think I should buy? I don't want to buy a Ferrari. Everybody's got a Ferrari. And Jay Leno says, don't say that. People want to kill you. Not everybody has a Ferrari. In fact, a lot of people don't have a Ferrari, and lots of people have never actually laid eyes on a Ferrari. They lived in a bubble. They didn't understand at the Oscars just a couple days ago. Some of the women, these dresses that they wear to the Oscars are like $10, $20, $30, $50,000. And some of the women, as a way of acknowledging that they were going to recycle, they wore the dress that they'd worn another year. Worn it twice. Can you imagine wearing this? Now, to be fair, I've worn this jacket before. It's not the first time, and I'll wear it again probably. But you see, these people live in a bubble. But the Jewish leaders didn't want to be seen as aloof. They wanted to be seen as like the common people. And they were kind of walking a tightrope because they had to make these decisions, but they didn't want to be too obvious. If you look over at Acts 5, verse 33, but I'll tell you the story. Peter and John were doing all these incredible miracles, and the high priest arrested them because they were jealous. And they were arrested and they were put in jail. And they were sitting in jail, and the angel came and let them out and told them to go preach in the temple in the morning. And the high priests got together for this trial, and they said, go get Peter and John from the temple, and they weren't there. Well, where are they? No one knew. No one could answer why the temple, the prison was locked up. And then somebody came and said, those two men, they're in the temple preaching. And so they brought them to them and said that you have to stop doing this. And Peter, the apostle, and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. And in verse 33 it says, but when they heard this, they were cut to the quick and immediately intended to kill them. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, respected by all the people, stood up in the council and gave orders to put the men outside for a short time. And he said to them, men of Israel, take care what you propose to do with these men. For some time ago, Thaddeus rose up, claiming to be someone, and a group of about 400 men joined up with him. But he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away some men after him, and he too perished, and all those that followed him were scattered. So in this present case, I say to you, stay away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or action is of men, it will be overthrown. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them, or else you may even be found fighting against God. The point is that they were used to this type of thing. It was a very fine balance of deciding what they're going to do, how are they going to deal with these situations. Now, to be fair with them, they would say in their own defense, look, it's for the greater good. We're just doing a little surgical cut here and there once in a while, so Rome doesn't come in and destroy the entire nation, which they did in AD 70 because of the rebellion. Anyway, they had many questions prepared in advance, and as I said earlier, they had people following him around, seeing what he was doing, what he was saying, so they already knew what this was all about. The type of questions would prove that they knew the answer, and it was all a trick. There was nothing worthy of arresting him, and they should have known this. They should have been like Nicodemus, who was ready to acknowledge him as the Messiah. So number 2, you have the proof, present it. 20 and 21 says, Jesus answered them, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, and all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. So why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. And they know what I said. In a trial, if you have all the evidence, it's unnecessary to question the one who is being charged. You don't need to. It's unnecessary. And he, by the way, has no obligation of answering any questions. Even at that time, you did not have the obligation to convict yourself. Well, and there was no case against Jesus. There's a proverb that says, be careful not to listen too closely, because the people you're around you may be talking about you, and your feelings will be hurt. It's important not to listen too closely, but that's not Jesus. He's not talking behind their back. He just said everything I said, and not only was he not worried about saying anything, he was also not worried about insulting them. He called them a brood of vipers. Another place in Matthew 23:27, he said, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like the white sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outside, but are within are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness." This is one of those, if you had a contest of insulting, this is a really, really good insult. Because the Jewish leaders knew that if they touched a human bone, they were unclean, and they had to wash, and they would be unclean. Well, Jesus is saying, not only do you have to worry, you don't have to worry about touching human bones, you're full of them. You're full of uncleanness. No matter what you do, there's no way to clean. So, what I'm saying is, he wasn't worried about saying these things in public. It's not like he's talking treason in secret and milk and cookies in the public. He said everything he was going to say. On top of this, Jesus is saying, you leaders had the same opportunity as Moses and Abraham to hear the very words of God coming from his mouth, and you failed to take advantage. Shame on you. Now the question is, now, was there a case against the religious leaders? And the answer is yes. Jesus has laid it out. You had these opportunities. He caught them in what they said, and it was clear that there was any defense that they had was now gone. If they were truly servants of God seeking his favor and trying to know what his mind was, they would have committed to him. They would have, do you remember the story of the rich young ruler? The rich young ruler came to Jesus and said, what must I do to receive eternal life? And Jesus told him. And if these men were like the rich young ruler, they had the opportunity. They could have followed him. And they should have given up their privilege and followed him if that's what he asked them to do. Number 3 is confirming weakness. In verse 22, and when he said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, is this the way you answer the high priest? And if you remember, they brought him bound. So we assume his hands are bound, so he has no way to defend himself. He's bound. This is a sad case of bad behavior that's been encouraged instead of corrected. That if you ask a soldier, do you understand what kind of behavior will get you in the stockade and what kind of behavior will get you praised? They know. They understand that if they do certain things, they're going to get in serious trouble. And the people that should be blamed here are their bosses. How is it that he was allowed this freedom to mistreat prisoners and nobody slapped him down for it? He didn't even think about it. He just backhanded him. You see, this is the fault of the high priest who allowed this thing to continue. And he was to blame for the failure of his soldier. You see, if this was a contest and you were looking for who won, Jesus won this contest. David Jeremiah told this story of when he was early on, he was a pastor, and he came to this church and everything was going well except one man was at everything he tried to do, he was diametrically opposed to it. And it eventually came to a head, and there was an important decision the church was going to make, and everyone was there, and the elder was there, and he gave his case of what he thought should be done, and then he stepped to the side, and he allowed David Jeremiah to have his case. And so he was over here, and the guy was getting so mad that he just went like this and backhanded David Jeremiah across the face. The story is the guy had to hold his son back because his son was going to go defend him. But he said, look, it's won. Your dad has won the contest. And that's what happened. The guy couldn't control his anger. He shortly thereafter left the church, and David didn't have to deal with him anymore. Well, this is what happened with Jesus. He didn't react in kind, and the tide was turning. The elders were soon left in disgrace. We know what happened eventually to the chief priests. Jesus won. Now, it's always within the rights of the master to question his servant as to, why are you doing this? And if he's found wanting, it's within the preview of the master to judge his servant. Now, these men were supposedly the servants of God, just as Jesus was the servants of God. And if you judged, you would judge that Jesus won. He was the one that acted properly in this exchange. Well, if this was a trial, and these people, the chief priests, were on trial, and the defendant had bungled the job. If this was their best defense, they had messed it up. Jesus had acted properly. Well, verse 23 says, Jesus answered him, if I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? Well, Jesus had them on the ropes. There was now a contempt of court charge against them. And all these high-priced teachers of the law had broken it. And if you are following my reasoning that these men were on trial, it wasn't Jesus. His trial was already done in the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, these guys have bungled the job. They knew the law. They were without excuse. And what can we do if the ones that are the most responsible have messed this up? Well, we stand condemned. And we just have to wait for the gavel to fall and the sentencing. If Josh McDowell is correct, and this is evidence that demands a verdict, you may have already guessed what the verdict is. The knowledge that Jesus is guilty as charged, and he is the Son of God who came to take away the sins of the world. If that's not how you feel, if you're like the high priest, then you're kind of like this song. Do you remember Simon and Garfunkel? Many years ago, in the early 60s, they had this song, Slip Sliding Away. This is one of the verses. God only knows. God makes his plan. The information unavailable to the mortal man. We're working our jobs, collect our pay. Believing we're gliding down the highway, but in fact we're slip sliding away. Well, the man in the song who slip sliding away is like my neighbor who chose to believe that this was all made up by somebody who had an agenda. He was happy to believe that the information was unavailable to the modern man, the mortal man. But that's not true. The high priests who were putting Jesus on trial had the information. Jesus told them that he had spoken nothing in secret. In fact, mostly what he had said had been relayed back to him. They probably had basic understanding of what he said on the Sermon on the Mount. They'd heard that he drove out demons, and they probably heard what the demons said. Unless he stopped them, the demons all said, "You are the Son of God." They'd seen the miracles. They knew that Lazarus had been risen from the dead after 4 days in the tomb. But still they didn't accept that this was clearly, all of this pointed that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, today, the sad thing is that we have the greatest access to the truth in Canada, in North America, and we're quickly becoming a nation who has no time for Jesus. Our society is like the religious leaders. They think that Christians and that Jesus' message is the problem and has to be rooted out and forced to recant our beliefs as evil and the cause of all the problems we face in the world. If I'm right in my appraisal, that these proceedings were really the religious leaders who were on trial, and Jesus was speaking the words that would convict them of the worst possible outcome, which is, if that's the case, if we are convicted, if the Holy Spirit is saying to us, this Jesus has proved himself to be the Savior of the world. He doesn't have to, but he doesn't want to condemn you. See, here's the thing, is if we're convicted and the Holy Spirit is saying the claims of Jesus are true, but you don't have to be condemned, because I've taken that punishment for you so that you can be redeemed and set free from the consequences of your sin. Death, the sentence that you earned, has been carried out on Jesus. And now he's offering you life forever with him. But you must choose. The last verse that we read, verse 23 says, and Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. You know, the people that were there, the soldier, the Annas, the other people, the other leaders, chose to be condemned and took the guilty sentence on themselves. But please don't follow their bad example. Choose Jesus and salvation, because it's true. It has been true since it was written about by Luke and John and Mark. It's all true. And we need to recognize that Jesus is who he said he is. He is our salvation. He is the rock. He is the one who takes away the sin of the world. Let's pray. Lord Jesus.